Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 6 of International Political Economy. Just going to double check I'm recording. Yes, I am. Okay, good. I'm always paranoid about that. This week, we're going to be looking at a pivotal event in the early 1990s, which was the collapse of the Soviet Union. This is a really important historical point, which changed, obviously, our world from the bipolar Cold War order to a more unipolar American-led and American-dominated order afterwards. And it also had really important implications for global finance, commodities, and also political movements around the world. So this is an area that isn't often focused on all that much in your courses, and I'm going to try to do a little bit more detail about it. A lot of it I hope will be for your interest, but there's also very important political economy currents that we'll be dealing with while looking at the Soviet Union and its collapse. So let's move on. So this is the learning objectives for this week. I'll be addressing some of these in this lecture and some in the next, and then obviously we'll be having our regular tutorials to hit on any remaining ones. These are the required readings as well. And again, for anyone who hasn't put themselves down for the book club, please make sure you do so before the end of the semester. That is really important, not only for class discussion, but also for your participation marks as well. Okay, so let's start with what exactly was the Soviet Union. And here I have a map of the United Socialist States of the Soviet Republics, or the USSR, or otherwise known as the Soviet Union. You'll notice sometimes in your readings that either the USSR and the Soviet Union are used interchangeably. Some authors use the USSR to refer to the entirety of these socialist states here, while some authors also use the Soviet Union to refer to just the Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian federation, as they were kind of like the central part of the broader brotherly republics. So I'll generally be using them interchangeably. I will point out when I'm referring to more the central Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian republics of the Soviet Union. So like I mentioned before, the early 1990s was a really watershed moment in global history. The Soviet Union, which was the United States' global rival and a seemingly unbreakable socialist leviathan, apparently suddenly collapsed in the early 1990s, which ended the Cold War, which had dominated politics since World War II. We're going to be examining this event as well as many other turbulent events during the 1990s, which also spawned from the dissolution of the Union of the Soviet Socialist republics. Now, most analysts have put down the collapse of the socialist system to either the ticking time bomb of continued failed economic policies, which had finally imploded the Soviet Union, or due to the inevitable triumph of neoliberals' forward march, which we touched on last week. And this is most famously exemplified by Francis Fukuyama's proclamation of the end of history, when the Soviet Union fell, because it was seen that global liberal or neoliberal capitalism had won and that there was going to be no more developments afterwards, so no more history. However, what I want to ask here for us all is, well, what does the critical understanding of political economy add to this story? And following going through these events, we're also going to look at the implications of the collapse of the USSR, as well as the Socialist Federation of Yugoslavia in our next lecture, and also kind of try to understand the economic reforms which occurred in these areas as neoliberalism sought to tame the wild East. So this is kind of the agenda today. Now, it's impossible to really recount the entire history of the Soviet Union in just a 1 hour lecture, which I hope will just hopefully be 1 hour. But I want to give you an understanding of the intense debates that rage in history and political economy studies over the Soviet Union, even to this day. That is really far departed from the orthodox mainstream understanding of the USSR that you would most likely see in most school textbooks or newspaper articles. So the history of the Soviet Union is usually presented in the following terms, which reflects something of an inevitable straight line in Soviet history and politics. And the story goes as follows. So in October 1917, the Bolsheviks, who were the Communist Party, which was a small, unrepresentative, and already or embryonically totalitarian party, usurped power and thus betrayed the Russian Revolution of February 1917. From that moment on, as in 1917, Soviet history was determined by the totalitarian political dynamics of the Communist Party, as personified by its original leader, Lenin. Monopolistic politics, ruthless tactics, ideological orthodoxy, programmatic dogmatism, disciplined leadership, and centralized bureaucratic organization. Having quickly monopolized the new Soviet government and created a rudimentary totalitarian party state, the communists won the Russian Civil War of 1918 to 1919 by discipline, organization, and ruthlessness. Now, exhausted and faced with the need to settle the Lenin succession, the party then retreated tactically in the 1920s from its totalitarian designs on society by temporarily adopting less authoritarian policies known as the New Economic Policy. But in 1928 to 29, its internal house having been put in order by Stalin, the new leader of the party, the Bolsheviks, driven by ideological zealotry, resumed the totalitarian assault on society. The process culminated logically and inevitably in the 1930s, the years of imposed collectivization and forced industrialization, as the party totalitarianized society through mass terror and expanded structures of bureaucratic control. A total party state emerged, autonomous social institutions and processes, indeed the boundary between state and society, were totally destroyed. Full-blown totalitarianism had to abate somewhat during the war with Germany in World War II, but it then re-emerged, a monolithic, ideological, terroristic party state headed by Stalin, ruling omnipotently over a passive, frozen society of atomized new citizens. So this is, in brief, the quite orthodox and mainstream view on the Soviet Union, and most understandings of this, especially in university courses in this country, kind of begins and ends here. Now, we'll touch on a few of these aspects to give an idea of the range of debates that still occur on this complex history. But one of the main questions that I want to deal with at the moment is the relationship between the original Bolshevik party and then the totalitarianism of Stalin, because that will also give us a good foothold to then understand the rest of the Soviet Union's developments before it's collapsed. So the link between Bolshevism and Stalinism is one of the most complex, heated debates, and even one of the more important ones in terms of the earlier Soviet Union. And so it's probably the most logical one to begin with here. So most essentially and generally, it's the question of whether the original Bolshevik movement that dominated the Soviet Union for a decade after 1917 and the subsequent events and socio-political order that emerged under Stalin in the 1930s should be interpreted in terms of fundamental continuity or a discontinuity. And now on this question, the orthodoxy posts a very uncomplicated conclusion. There's no meaningful differences or discontinuity that existed between Bolshevism and Stalinism, which were fundamentally the same politically and ideologically. And I guess what is being explained and argued in this thesis of a fundamental continuity from Lenin to Stalin in this orthodoxy should be hopefully quite clear, where the most historic and murderous acts of Stalinism between 1929 and 1939 and then beyond, which included, forcible wholesale collectivization to the execution, brutal imprisonment of millions of people. All of that, it is argued, derived from the political, being the ideological, programmatic, and organizational nature of original Bolshevism. The determinative quality of that argument is really striking, as its emphasis on a single causal factor, which we're now going to try to break down in some more detail. Now, Bolshevism was a far more diverse political movement that emerged in late Tsarist Russia, ideologically, programmatically, generationally, and in many other respects than is usually acknowledged in scholarship and in teaching in this area. Another related convention of the continuity thesis should also be questioned, which is the equating of Bolshevism and Leninism, Lenin, who is pictured here. So Lenin was plainly the singular Bolshevik. His leadership, ideas, and personality shaped the movement in fundamental ways. But Bolshevism was still larger and more diverse than Lenin and Leninism. Its ideology, policies, and politics were shaped also by other forceful leaders, lesser members in committees, non-party constituents, and great social events, including World War I, the Revolution, and the Russian Civil War. And especially the Russian Civil War, to take this particular example, had a major impact on Bolshevik outlook, which revived the self-conscious theory of an embattled vanguard developed by Lenin in 1902, which had been inoperative or inconsequential for at least a decade, and implanting in the once very civilian-minded party what a leading Bolshevik at the time called a military Soviet culture. But then official ideology changed very radically under Stalin. Several of those changes have been noted by prominent Western and Soviet scholars, where there was a revival of nationalism, statism, anti-Semitism, and conservative and reactionary cultural and behavioral norms. There was a repeal of ideas and legislation which had favored workers, women, school children, minority cultures, and egalitarianism that had been present with the original Bolshevik Revolution, as well as a host of revolutionary Bolshevik symbols, and a switch in emphasis from ordinary people to leaders and official bosses as the creators of history. These were not simply just amendments, but a totally new ideology that was changed in its very essence, and that did not represent the same movement as that which took power in 1917. And politically, the Bolshevik system had been one of party dictatorship characterized by oligarchical leadership politics in the ruling party. Now, after 1936 and Stalin's Great Purge, and despite this kind of seemingly outward continuity of organizational forms and official nomenclature, the one-party system had given way to a one-person system, the ruling party to a ruling personage. Stalin's terror broke the back of the party and eliminated it as a ruling class, which had been amply confirmed by recent evidence that has come to light by post-Soviet and Western scholars. The Stalinist purges swept away at least 1 million of the Bolshevik party members between 1935 and 1939. The essence of Bolshevism and even Leninism after that was basically, no more. The elite, which was basically massacred virtually as a whole, its general membership as well, which had been totally decimated, its ethos and role were no longer those of the old party or even the party of 1934. The Communist Party still obviously played a role in the Soviet system and remained enshrined in the official political culture, but even in a new, Stalinist form, the party's political importance fell well below that of the police and its official esteem below that of the state. It's even, especially during Stalin's time, its deliberative and decision-making bodies, like as the Party Congress, the Central Committee, and even the Politburo, which was the leading forum of Soviet leaders, rarely convened. Now, economically, the Bolsheviks had no well-defined economic policies upon coming to office in October 1917. There were generally held Bolshevik goals and tenets like, socialism, workers' control, nationalization, large-scale farming, planning, and the like, but these were quite vague and subject to the most varying interpretations inside the party. The initial program of the Bolshevik government when it came to power, in the sense of some kind of officially declared policy, was what Lenin called in April 1918 state capitalism, which was a mixture of socialist measures and concessions to the existing capital structure and control of the economy. Now, this then changed to the actual policies of war communism during the Russian Civil War in June 1918, which was in response to the threat of a prolonged civil war and diminishing supplies, a situation that immediately outdated Lenin's conciliatory state capitalism. War communism was the extreme nationalization, grain requisitioning, and monopolistic state intervention which was effected during the Civil War of 1918 to 1920. Now, following the end of the Russian Civil War, state policy in the early Soviet Union was that of the new economic policy, the moderate agricultural and industrial policies and mixed public-private economy of between 1921 and 1928. The kind of social political order of the NEP, the new economic policy, had an officially tolerated social pluralism in economic, cultural, intellectual, and even political life in local Soviets and even high state agencies, which represents a historical model of Soviet communist rule, which was radically unlike Stalinism. Now, the NEP had originated as an ignoble retreat in 1921 as the economic situation was dire. And there was quite a lot of resentment at new economic policy economics, the politics and culture. And that continued throughout the 1920s. Now, Stalin would tap these real sentiments for his kind of civil war reenactment of 1929 to 1933 when he took over the party. But for kind of reasons beyond our concern here, by 1924, the NEP had acquired a general legitimacy among Bolshevik leaders before Stalin's attack. So I guess the point at the moment here is not to explain the fateful events of Stalin's takeover in 1928 to 29, and then his new policies up to 1933, which is called the Great Change, but to emphasize that they were a departure from the more heterodox and broad Bolshevik programmatic thinking. No Bolshevik leader had, or even faction, had ever advocated anything that was similar to imposed collectivization, the liquidation of allegedly prosperous peasants, breakneck heavy industrialization, and the destruction of the entire market sector, and some kind of plan that was in reality no plan at all, only some kind of hyper-centralized control of the economy, plus exportations. So now, after Stalin's time in power in the Soviet Union, we are skipping forward a little bit here. Contrary to quite widespread misconceptions in the West, neither the Soviet Communist Party nor its high-level officialdom had ever been politically monolithic, as I kind of already hinted at during the early Soviet Union. And even at this later time, when the party was reconstituted after Stalin's death, there was nearly 20 million members by the 1980s. And anyone who wanted to engage in sanctioned politics had to enter the communist establishment. And with a country and various countries with such divisive kind of living histories, there were very much a range of ideas and politics around the Communist Party of the Soviet Union after Stalin. And ideological and policy debates had ranged openly in the party elite in the early days of the Russian Revolution until Stalin kind of settled those issues by firing squad in the 1930s and frightened any survivors into silence. Now, when the terror ended upon Stalin's death in the 1950s, conflicting policy and ideological views reappeared in the party-controlled press, sometimes rather candidly, but usually in muted ways, depending on the degree of relative censorship at that time. Now, Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, who followed after Stalin's death, initiated several reforms that we're kind of unable to, unfortunately, deal with in a lot of detail here. But importantly, there was three intra-party movements that those reforms helped to shape, political movements that had kind of reconstituted themselves and appeared as solid social movements by the time Khrushchev was overthrown in 1964. There was firstly anti-Stalinist reformers who called for a substantial reduction of controls over society, including more political liberalization and some marketization of the state economy. There was neo-Stalinist reactionaries who charged that Khrushchev's reforms had gravely weakened the party government controls, and orthodoxies who demanded that they be strengthened, if not fully restored. And then party conservatives who objected to the excesses of both Stalin's rule and Khrushchev's reforms and sought mainly to preserve the new post-Stalin status quo by opposing any further significant changes, whether forward or backwards. Now, the Conservative majority, which was headed by the authoritarian but quite mild-mannered Brezhnev, who was the new Secretary General of the Communist Party and leader of the Soviet Union, ruled the USSR for the next 2 decades, with some concessions to the neo-Stalinists. So the party's reform movement, which was embryonic at that stage, barely survived, but it did eventually come to power with Gorbachev as its leader in the late 1980s. And there was several kind of large factors that lay behind the reemergence of reform-minded officials in the Communist Party on the eve of Brezhnev's death in 1982. The USSR had developed at that time into a more urban and educated society. There was the aging and passing of the old guard that had risen to high office under Stalin, the ascent of the Gorbachev generation that had entered politics under Khrushchev, the Soviet elite's greater exposure to the West, All of these things encouraged the reform movement, but the system's mounting economic problems were the most important. The hyper-centralized bureaucratic management had made the economy increasingly irrational and inefficient, which thwarted even minor changes and isolated it from technological developments in capitalist countries. By the late 1970s, economic growth had virtually stopped, while enormous state expenditures for the Cold War military and for the cradle-to-grave welfare provisions of Soviet socialism, including large subsidies for most essential goods and services, continued to grow. And now we're going to look into probably our major focus here and most important focus, which is the economics of the USSR. Now, we discussed last week that the 1970s was a turbulent time for the global political economy. Now, many in the West at this time believed that the economic crises that were exposed in the early 1970s had demonstrated fundamental flaws in both capitalism and democracy. The combination of widespread unemployment and high inflation throughout the West confounded both professional economists who studied market economies and the democratically elected leaders who governed them. The reigning economic doctrine of Keynesianism offered very few answers in this world of stagflation, and those it did put forth, such as more government spending and accommodating monetary policy, appeared to make things only worse. Now, in foreign policy, a new buzzword had emerged in the West: interdependence. And that dominated discussion in terms of what was the West's place in the world in the 1970s. And it also appeared to suggest an end to the Western society's control over their own fates. And people thought, like, what could the developed West do in the face of dependence from, on oil from the Middle East, for example? And to many on both sides of the Iron Curtain, which is the name for the kind of the wall, both real and not real, separating the Soviet Union and the West. To many on both sides of this Iron Curtain, the answer appeared to be, well, the West couldn't do anything at all. And the question was, like, could democratic leaders solve this problem of stagflation if it meant inflicting pain on those they governed? And most people said they probably couldn't. Now, the Eastern Bloc was thought to be different, the Soviet Union. Socialist states appeared to Western observers to be largely immune to the crises affecting the capitalist world. Socialist leaders even maintained quite a confidence in the superiority of their own system at this time. The Soviet Union was one of the world's largest producers of energy resources, and so the fourfold increase in the price of oil at the end of 1973 arrived as a financial windfall rather than as a structural economic challenge for the Soviet leadership in Moscow. The socialist states of Eastern Europe had little oil themselves, but under the generous patronage of the Soviet Union, again, this is the more central Moscow, Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian Federation, they received large and growing deliveries of Soviet energy during the 1970s at highly subsidized prices. Now, almost all trade and prices were fixed under 5-year plans within the Soviet bloc, and so that kind of helped shield socialist states from the violent gyrations of inflation and commodity price shocks that crippled the Western world, because prices were set for 5 years. So regardless of what happened in the outside world, they were set. Now, in the first half of the 1970s, because of the success of the socialist bloc, or the seeming success, Western banks had been very eager to loan money to them. It had energy, it had authoritarianism, it had no inflation. But by 1976, the first inklings of doubt had begun to bubble up in the minds of Western bankers. Would socialist states really be able to pay them back? Now, all states in the, this is kind of another broader term, the Council of Mutual Economic Assistance, or Comecon, and this is the Council of Mutual Economic Assistance. You can see, on the map here, the red is the Soviet Union, or the USSR, and then the yellow and red elsewhere are the other kind of brotherly countries around the world who are part of Comecon at various stages. These countries in Comecon had a dependence not only on Soviet oil and politics, but also on Western capital at this time. There was thus a problem that was lurking in the background here. With the Comecon and broader socialist states. After a 10-year period of very dramatic growth, Soviet energy resources began to plateau in the mid-1970s and were projected to decline after 1980. The Eastern Bloc's apparent imperviousness to the travails of the global economy rested on two foundations, which were easy access to Western capital and an ever-increasing supply of Soviet energy resources. Now, if either or both of these faltered, as they actually would by around 1980, the entire bloc would be forced to reckon with the social, economic, and political problems that had been besetting the West after 1973. Now, as these crises did affect the West, the promise of the post-war order had to be kept alive. Even, which we discussed last week, even as its economic foundation, crumbled all around it. Across the West, governments of the unions they supported ensured that the living standards of the working class were protected as the oil price shock took hold in 1974, as we noted last week. Across the West, the first reaction of every political system was to protect the nation's workers from the challenging global market in the Keynesian system. Now, recapping briefly on what we noted last week, some additional detail, these promises of post-war politics, were not easily lost. And as the challenges mounted for the West, they had to find more money. Now, at this time, there was something called the euro markets, which were the forerunners of today's unregulated global capital markets. They presented one possible avenue for distributing world savings from oil producers back to oil-consuming nations. And again, is not a part of the story we normally talk about. We usually focus on the petrodollars that go to the US banks, as I mentioned last week. But now we're turning our mind to the euro market's role in this crisis. Now, founded in 1955, using the European surplus US dollars at that time, the euro markets were made up of all the currency held outside its country of origin, and where trade between those currencies happened, and they were subject to very little regulation, but they were quite small at that time, so it didn't create too many stirrings in the global economy. Now, the US dollar was the most important and widely used currency in international trade. Euro dollars, which meant US dollars within Europe, represented the overwhelming majority of liquidity in the euro markets. And by the 1970s, the markets were valued at about 80 billion. And in the first 10 months of 1974, the OPEC nations, we spoke about, who got this huge windfall of money, deposited 16.5 billion of their 45 billion surplus in the euro markets. And this is actually more than that went to the United States, the petrodollars that went to the United States, which was only 10.5 billion. So this was a really strong boost for the unregulated markets, but most doubted it could last. And the actual huge inflow created a lot of problems with the euro markets. West Germany's largest private bank collapsed under the pressure of speculative foreign exchange losses. And many in the finance community believed that this crash of West Germany's major bank would be the first of many dominoes to fall if the money from the OPEC states kept flowing in to private banks and the euro markets. Banks were using short-term deposits from OPEC countries to make loans to oil importing countries, who really need the money, with maturities which ranged from 7 to 10 years. And as the Wall Street Journal noted at that time, they said this was borrowing short and lending long, which was the banker's classical formula for trouble. Now, by late 1974, it actually became clear that the oil producers had no interest in using finance to destabilize the countries that purchased their oil, and they moved to secure their deposits with Western banks on a longer-term basis. Now, banks, in turn, and especially in the euro markets, they found fewer reasons to worry about lending to countries. Now, by the summer of 1975, a US Treasury official at the time reported that the financing problems due to the OPEC financial accumulations now are generally recognized by most banks as manageable. So from that time onwards, government efforts to control the recycling process of this money in the euro markets, these efforts waned. They seemed that it was okay. There wasn't a financial collapse, and the vast majority of sovereign borrowing stayed on the euro markets, which continued to ensure they had skyrocketing growth for the remainder of the 1970s. Now, this was, for the history of both democratic capitalist and state socialist governments, a really fateful development. With the world's surplus capital now at their disposal, the international financial community became an arbiter of politics around the world. Now, neither bankers nor most politicians were eager to see the role of finance in these terms, but it was true. And any nation state, either east or west, that relied on borrowed capital to fund the products of its domestic politics were now subject to the capricious confidence of capitalists. especially banking and finance capitalists. As long as markets remain convinced that borrowed capital would be repaid on time and with interest by countries, politics within states could then proceed normally. Now, politicians could continue to promise their people prosperity, and the legitimacy of the government could survive unquestioned. But should market confidence ever falter, the domestic politics of borrowing states would be thrown into immediate disarray in both East and West. The temptation to use the borrowed capital to support domestic living standards proved too strong to resist. Now, in this context, the Comecon and socialist states appeared well positioned. Until the mid-1970s, we mentioned the prices with Comecon were fixed as part of their 5-year planning process. So in 1970, the USSR had set the price for its oil within Comecon for the next 5 years at roughly $2.43 a barrel. Now, at that time, oil prices on the world market hovered about $2 a barrel. So the Comecon states paid actually a slight premium for their Soviet oil. It was a premium they were happy to pay because trade with the Soviet Union was not conducted in hard currency. Currencies that were freely convertible, such as the US dollar, the pound, or the West German mark. The Soviet oil was priced in rubles for accounting purposes, but the actual trade between the Comecon states was conducted on a barter basis within these 5-year plans. Before the oil crisis, planners would use the 5-year planning process to determine that Soviet oil was worth, a certain amount of East German television sets, Polish ships, or Czechoslovak engineering equipment, and then trade for the entire period would proceed at that price. Now, the commodity price explosions of the early 1970s fundamentally altered this dynamic. Within a matter of months from late 1973 to early 1974, the world market value of the Soviet Union's energy resources quadrupled. And with it, the country's dominion over the rest of the bloc became an enormous economic liability. Because as long as world oil prices remained, above $10 a barrel, any deliveries of Soviet oil to Eastern Europe at $2.50 a barrel meant, a huge loss on the sale of the country's most valuable asset. But if then the Kremlin adjusted the Comecon prices to reflect the new world markets, then Eastern Bloc countries would have to dramatically increase their exports to the Soviet Union to pay the new prices. This increase in exports would have to come at the expense of domestic consumption, and thus it had the potential to disrupt the unwritten social contracts of late socialism and produce severely destabilizing social unrest. Now, after this oil crisis, a new tension defined relations among the fraternal allies. The economic interests of the Soviet Union now stood in stark opposition to the political, economic, and social priorities of the bloc as a whole. Now, ultimately, it was the Soviet Union, the central bodies that had the oil, so it was the Kremlin that set the policy. They chose to now base the post-oil crisis 1975 oil price on an average of the 3 preceding years, in order to include, a year with low, medium, and high oil prices. And then after 1975, Soviet officials decreed that the Comecon price system would adjust based on a rolling average of the previous 5 years of world market prices. Now, this appeared difficult to Soviet officials, and they were a bit worried about this, but it appeared life-threatening to the Eastern European satellite states. Even under this sliding price system, it was now quite clear the price of energy for these bloc countries would dramatically increase. And it presented the potential of social and political disruption. Now, the first estimate of some of the losses of the Comecon countries came with that of the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany. This projected an additional cost of 7 to 8 billion marks for the German Democratic Republic in 1975, and 8 to 9 billion marks per year during the next 4 years. And to put the scale of these costs in perspective, the state planners warned the Politburo, or the central decision-making body in the Soviet Union, that the new annual costs for Soviet oil were more than the annual increase in national income for many Soviet satellite states. This created huge concern because it was feared that it would negatively affect the living standards of the population, and especially as most leaders in Comecon had achieved their positions by promising rising living standards to their citizens. And throughout the bloc, the higher living standards were the price of social peace. Now, in a supreme irony, it was only the development of global finance capitalism that actually then turned out to allow late socialism to exist. Without the explosive growth of global capital markets after 1970, so with the US banks receiving petrodollars, the euro markets getting euro dollars, and particularly after 1974, the governing model of late socialism would not have been possible. Now, 1975 approached. The Eastern European leaders were determined not to let increases in Soviet energy prices lead to a fall in domestic living standards. And so they had no choice but to test how much money Western capital markets would let them borrow. Now, to universal surprise, it turned out to be quite a lot. And it became clear that private banks could manage the petrodollar recycling on a permanent basis. And then, economic plans around the world that had been deemed not financeable in 1973, especially in the Soviet Union, became affordable by 1975 because there was so much credit out there. The rapid expansion of the euro markets, pushed the horizon for living on credit to a level that would have been deemed dangerous and impractical just a couple of years earlier. So Western banks were flush with cash and eager to find places to put it. And the time was ripe for a marriage of convenience. And in 1975, the Eastern Bloc borrowed more money than they had ever done before. The euro currency loans to the bloc more than doubled from 1974 to 1975, from 1 to 2.4 billion. The surplus capital generated by a global crisis in capitalism was now funding the state socialism defense against the global capitalist system. Now, banks seemed to agree that they had lent Comecon too much, but they couldn't help themselves from lending more. Euro currency credits to the communist world had increased 33% in 1976 to 3.2 billion, and there was no end in sight. And this also meant that the debt burden of the socialist bloc would continue to rise through the end of the 1970s and would remain onerous through the rest of the Cold War. Now, even if the question of access to Western credit markets turned out to be surprisingly easy for Eastern Bloc states to solve, the question of how to use the borrowed capital was infinitely vexing. Every foreign borrowing strategy in the Eastern Bloc was at least officially premised on a single and simple idea. They would use the hard currency to import Western technology, modernize their domestic production, and then develop industries capable of producing exports to the world market that would earn enough hard currency to pay off the loans. Now, in each case, some of the imported capital made it to the way of improving Eastern European factories and production processes, but much of it really just merely presented rampant opportunities to expand domestic corruption and patronage networks. The decision to base long-term development on future exports to the world market also broke an important barrier between Comecon and the rest of the world economy. In order to win in global export markets, these Eastern Bloc countries had to compete with developing countries of Latin America and East Asia to sell their goods in the developed West. And this competition subjected Eastern Bloc goods to direct competition with capitalist goods and pitted socialist methods of production and the generally high wages that they enjoyed against the capitalist method the bloc had long eschewed. It was a competition that the Soviet bloc would lose time and time again in the 1970s. And despite the constant exhortations from the very top echelon of each state's governing structure about the importance of increasing exports and producing these hard currency trade surpluses, the Eastern European members of Comecon, and this is excluding the Central Soviet Union of Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, ran a cumulative hard currency trade deficit from throughout most of the 70s, which ended up being about 26 billion. And this was because they simply were not producing goods that Westerners wanted to buy. If the trade surpluses required to pay back the debt could not be created through increases in exports, they would need to be created through decreases in imports. That in turn meant only one thing: the challenge of austerity lurked just around the corner, which had been plaguing Western capitals during this time. Now, interestingly enough, and maybe despite what many might think, the power of the working class was actually stronger in Western states than in the East. And most governments on both sides of the Iron Curtain waited as long as financial markets would allow before asking their citizens to sacrifice through austerity measures. Western currencies were internationally convertible and Eastern currencies were not. And crises in the West appeared under a different name in the East. So currency crises affected Western societies as currency moved in and out of these countries easily, while debt crises came to hurt the Eastern European countries. But Western currency crises and Eastern debt crises were different manifestations of the same thing. International capital's loss of confidence in the viability of a nation's economy. And so they required the same response, which can be broadly defined as austerity, government policies that intentionally lower the living standards of the domestic population to restore financial markets' confidence in the national economy. Calling this austerity economic structural adjustment disguise the policy's fraught social and political consequences. This economic adjustment in both East and West was nothing short of a direct challenge to the legitimacy and governing ideology of any government that tried to implement it. Now, by 1977, the Soviet Union was predicted to have this significant oil crisis we noted. Its giant oil fields were projected to decline by the end of the decade, with replacement fields located in much harder to reach places that would make exploitation and transport extremely difficult and expensive. Now, with plateauing oil production, the Soviet Union would find it extremely difficult to continue to simultaneously meet its own requirements and those of Eastern Europe while exporting to non-communist countries at their present scale. These were really important considerations for the leadership in Moscow because the Kremlin supplied 3/4 of Eastern Europeans' oil, and it really, it wished to retain the political and economic leverage that goes with being their principal supplier. But at the same time, the oil exports to non-communist countries were the USSR's largest single source of hard currency. So the Soviet Union announced to the Comecon countries that it would taper its supply of energy to them. But these countries had been planning to increase the rate of growth of their energy consumption. So Soviet energy could no longer be Comecon's economic elixir. The news that the Soviet energy deliveries were likely to peak in 1980 sent shockwaves through the bloc. For states whose economic growth depended on ever-increasing inputs of energy rather than the more efficient use of energy, this message was nothing short of an existential threat. Now, Soviet stagnation was increasing and energy was getting more expensive and harder to get. The demand by Comecon for Western financial loans to help bridge these concerns deepened. But at the exact same time, when Western financial markets' confidence in the socialist bloc was wearing thin, as their debts continued to accumulate. And so with the Soviet raw material deliveries about to level off and Western financial confidence hanging by a thread, the task confronting all Eastern Bloc countries at the start of the 1980s was daunting. Now, only the US Federal Reserve, interestingly enough, could tip the scales and turn this array of warning signs into a full-blown crisis. Now, so long as the Fed in this situation, which is the engine of the global monetary creation because they created US dollars, so everyone traded in US dollars, so it was crucial for world liquidity. As long as the Fed kept real interest rates low and US dollars flowing easily around the world, socialist governments would be able to retain a veneer of tranquility amid the choppy waters of the world market. But now developments in the late 1970s to the early 80s caused a significant rupture that would change societies on both sides of the Iron Curtain forever. Now, 1979 brought renewed challenges. The crescendo of revolution in Iran led to the ouster of the Shah in January and a wave of uncertainty on world oil markets. At this time, Iran was the world's second largest oil producer, and it stopped exporting oil in December 1978. And the social instability that followed the Shah's departure provided reason to think those exports would not return anytime soon. Panic ensued, and the OPEC members again took the opportunity to engineer another massive increase in oil prices. From December 1978 to December 1979, crude oil prices rose 150%, this time from $13 a barrel to more than 30. Gas prices within the US climbed 55% in the first half of 1979, and inflation skyrocketed. If it was allowed to continue, there was no telling when international capital holders might lose confidence in the United States and precipitate another run on the currency as people pulled money out of the US. And so financial markets started to pressure Washington to implement austerity. The president at the time, who was Jimmy Carter, had asked Americans to tighten their belts and restrict their consumption. Now, down the road at the Federal Reserve, Paul Volcker, who we mentioned last week as the chairman, believed that the continuing inflation was a product of the people's expectations about the economy. By 1979, the rising prices had become such a standard part of life that people had begun to factor them into their behavior. Workers asked for higher wages, consumers borrowed more money, the government ran a larger deficit, and speculators bet against the US dollar because they universally accepted it as a fact that the US dollars would be worth less tomorrow than they were today. And these actions created this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. They created the very inflation that they anticipated. High wages, high borrowing, high government spending increased the demand for goods, and prices inevitably rose. Therefore, if inflation was to be vanquished, Volcker believed that expectations would have to be altered. Now, at this time as well, as we mentioned last week, there was this broad rise of neoliberal ideology. And one significant part of it was something called monetarism, which was a school of economic thought promoted at the University of Chicago by prominent thinkers such as Milton Friedman, which said that the sole responsibility of a central bank, such as the US Federal Reserve, was to ensure a constant annual rate of growth in a nation's money supply, and preferably at a quite low level of 3%. Now, Volcker, who initially was quite hostile to monetarist ideas, became attracted to monetarism because it offered an escape from political culpability. Because if under monetarism, the Federal Reserve could simply commit to growing the monetary supply at a constant low rate, then the dramatic and subsequent increase in interest rates that would inevitably result would appear to the public not as, this like active and mean-spirited decisions of the Fed, but rather as an unfortunate byproduct of market forces. The beautiful thing about this new monetarist policy was that as interest rates, would keep going up, the Fed could say, well, we're not actively raising the rate. We're just targeting and limiting the money supply. So they could raise rates and nobody could technically blame them. Now, Volcker implemented his shock, which we mentioned last week, and let interest rates dramatically increase. The fate of the nation, Volcker told Americans at a press conference where he announced the policy change, rested in the hands of the marketplace. Obviously, this was not actually true, because Volcker knew that by controlling the money supply, he was still controlling the amount of liquidity in the system and thus controlling interest rates, growth, and employment, or lack thereof. But the language of monetarism had now given him a way to shift responsibility for these policy outcomes to the market. Now, 5 weeks later, another event, again in Iran, that happened, had really nothing to do with the Cold War, socialism, or even finance, caused the Eastern Bloc's financial predicament to go from bad to worse. In November 1979, Iranian students stormed the American embassy in Tehran and took 52 Americans hostage. 10 days later, the Carter administrator responded by freezing all Iranian assets in US banks, which is roughly 11 billion at the time. The diplomatic crisis between Tehran and Washington played out over the next year, and the frozen Iranian assets caused significant uncertainty in the international financial community and further limited its willingness to lend to socialist states. The Soviet Union itself then hammered the final nail into its own coffin and its access to Western capital, because at the end of 1979, Soviet forces invaded Afghanistan in alleged support of the socialist government there. And then President Carter responded by placing a grain embargo on the Soviet Union and asking all US banks to review their credit policies towards the Eastern Bloc. He also announced a new US defense posture in the Middle East, dubbed the Carter Doctrine, and requested corresponding increases in the US military budget. This renewal of superpower tensions over Afghanistan destroyed the last semblance of normalcy for socialist borrowings in the euro market. Even in these first moments of the onrushing crisis at this stage, a decisive difference was already apparent between the now neoliberal capitalism emerging in the West and the state socialism, which really struggled to survive in the East. The post-World War II social democracy promises were now being broken in the West, and appeals to the market to justify the distribution of economic outcomes were now returning to prominence. And neoliberalism's embrace of individual freedom as the highest moral good, and especially rhetorically, and the critique of government intervention in the economy, again rhetorically, as we mentioned last week, provided this ideological framework that painted the politics of breaking these post-World War II promises in a very virtuous light. Now, in the socialist states, where the ruling communist parties proclaimed their, absolute control over society and the economy, they struggled to frame the politics of breaking their own promises to their population in ideological terms. This was the era of restructuring, across the world, led by the IMF and the World Bank in developing states, as we discussed last week. But equally, restructuring was demanded in the socialist East and capitalist West. By the early 1980s, financial institutions from every corner of the world were now pulling their money out of the communist bloc as a whole. For example, in Hungary in 1981, foreign banks withdrew 1.1 billion from Hungary and left Budapest with a measly 374 million to make the country's mounting debt payments. This new phase of the Cold War, which was namely an economic one, had three components. First, faced with mounting economic problems at home and geopolitical crises on the imperial periphery, Soviet leaders came to the historic decision that the burden of empire had become too much to bear, and they committed themselves to lightening that burden, even if it meant risking the loss of the empire itself. And the Polish crisis in 1980 was a really watershed moment in this regard, where the citizens were protesting in response to the rise in prices and austerity measures implemented there. And in the crucible of this crisis, the Soviet leaders decided they wouldn't invade Poland to crush the new social movement that had sought to represent the citizenry against the austere government called Solidarity. And even the Soviet leaders expressed a willingness to accept a Solidarity-led government in Warsaw. Now, at the same time, in recognition of the growing limits of their material capabilities, they cut back the energy resources they delivered to the rest of Eastern Europe. Allied governments in the region, protested this decision and warned that the cutbacks would leave them dangerously exposed to Western financial and political pressure. But Soviet leaders held firm to their conviction that the interests of the Soviet domestic economy were now more important than the political stability of their allies, which was, a historic revision of Soviet national interests that would have profound effects on the last decade of the Cold War. Now, second, the Reagan administration entered office with a keen awareness of the growing limits of Soviet material capabilities and aimed to exacerbate them. Reagan and his team attempted to force the Soviet leadership to choose between the three competing demands on its diminishing returns: its military, its allies, and its own population. Through the military build-up that bore his name, Reagan aimed to compel Soviet leaders to choose between continuing the arms race and maintaining support for the allies and domestic population. And through a coordinated campaign to limit Soviet access to Western financial markets and restrict Soviet energy sales on the world market, the administration aimed to cut off the Kremlin's access to the energy and financial wealth required to fund its military, diplomatic, and domestic commitments. Now, the result of these two factors was a perfect storm of crisis that produced this third element of the economic Cold War, the bailouts of Eastern Europe. Now, the decline in subsidized Soviet energy and the scarcity of global capital left these debtor countries of the region unable to pay their debt, and they're in search of a lifeline. Time and time again, they turned to the Soviet Union for aid, only to be spurned by Moscow. This left them with no choice but to seek Western aid, and in the early 1980s, Western governments and institutions bailed them out of their financial distress. These bailouts signaled a dramatic shift in the Cold War balance of power. If through the 1970s, Eastern Europe had been within the Soviet Union's economic sphere of influence, this umbrella, then from the early 1980s onward, the region came to rest under the economic umbrella of the West. And from that point on, it was Western governments and institutions rather than the Soviet Union that provided decisive economic aid to the region. And it was policymakers in Washington who attached conditions to their support. And this conditionality, which we mentioned last week, would in turn provide the West with a powerful tool to force the communist leaders of Eastern Europe to break their social contract with their respective population. Now, this set the stage for Gorbachev and the return of Soviet reformists. Now, Gorbachev, the last leader of the Soviet Union, well, not technically, we'll call him the last leader of the Soviet Union. His radical reforms evolved far beyond Khrushchev's kind of anti-Stalinist legacy. And he called for a return to the more tolerant kind of one-party dictatorship associated with Lenin and the new economic policy in the 1920s, and for rationalizing the stagnated economy, and which went beyond Leninism itself. By the late 1980s, pressured by this lower oil prices, the piling debt to Western banks, Gorbachev's program called for a mixed economy based on market relations, a multi-party parliamentary democracy based on the rule of law, a real federation of Soviet republics, and universal human values instead of Marxist-Leninist ones. Now, such tenets closely resembled those of European social democratic parties, and not at all those long practiced by the Soviet Communist Party in official discourse. Now, for some communist officials like Boris Yeltsin, who would become Russia's first independent president, Gorbachev's humane democratic socialism was too little or too late. But for many party functionaries, this was hearsay, and it was far too much. They fought against every plank of Gorbachev's program, clinging to Brezhnev-era fundamentalism or even lurching back to neo-Stalinism. Now, Gorbachev's program was named Perestroika, was an ideology of economic discipline that aimed to achieve a renewal of economic growth by implementing painful domestic reforms. And if that sounds familiar to you, it should, because that's austerity. Now, in seeking to launch an economic boom by significantly reducing the state's role in the Soviet economy and society, Perestroika was the socialist version of supply-side economics. Perestroika aimed to discipline the post-war Soviet social contract of full employment, stable prices, and heavy state subsidies and intervention in the economy to help address the economic pressures we have been addressing here. Now, despite the architect's aspirations, Perestroika failed miserably because Soviet leaders failed to accomplish the task at the heart of this ideology, which was to carry out painful reforms. Though they recognized the economic need for discipline, Soviet leaders consistently shied away from imposing disciplinary policies like price increases, bankruptcies, and unemployment because they feared the domestic political backlash. Gorbachev did try to build popular support for the difficulties of this economic reform by democratizing the Soviet political system to some extent, and he tried to reform state ideology, but he found himself unable to transgress the popular will and ideological legacy. Unlike Reagan and Thatcher in the US and UK, he had no easy recourse to an ideological tradition of liberalism that prized individualism and made a virtue out of economic discipline. The result was an economy that was anything but disciplinary. In the 4 short years between Gorbachev's accession to power in 1985 and then the revolutionary events of 1989 to 1990, the Soviet economy spiraled into inflationary chaos. Now, Gorbachev was not the only Cold War leader to unleash a massive supply-side tax cut and explode the budget deficit of his state. Now, Ronald Reagan had done pretty much this exact same thing in the United States, but Reagan had been saved from the inflationary consequences of his policies by the draconian monetary policy of Paul Volcker and the US Federal Reserve. Gorbachev had no equivalent savior, and in addition to the politics of perestroika, the Soviet financial system significantly contributed to the defeat of his drive to discipline. Unlike capitalist countries where the price stability became the policy priority of the 1980s, the Soviet government was not able to use monetary policy to control the nation's money supply. Instead, it made enterprises' assets convertible into cash, and by doing so, these reforms unexpectedly removed the government's control over the money supply and then caused a huge tsunami of liquidity. The result was runaway inflationary pressure. Now, by the fall of 1988, it became apparent that a general economic crisis of the socialist bloc was fast approaching. The various socialist governments were in huge amounts of debt. For example, by the late 1980s, the Polish state owed $39 billion to its creditors and sat at the mercy of Western governments, banks, and international institutions. These Western entities wielded what we might call the power of omission. They withheld the considerable resources of Western governments and global financial markets until political and economic conditions on the ground in places such as Poland conformed to their economic and political demands. So capitalist banks and international institutions led by the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, demanded that the communist government impose a capitalist perestroika on Polish society. They demanded that the government undertake a perestroika without resorting to violence or a renewal of martial law. The West demanded, basically, that promises be broken in Poland and broken peacefully to the population. The combination of these foreign and then, additional domestic pressures from social movements such as Solidarity in Poland, who exerted their own power over the government, eventually led to the collapse of communism in Poland and then in other Soviet satellite states. Ultimately, Eastern Bloc peoples would not accept the economic discipline unless it came from their government, a government they could recognize as themselves, not a totalitarian authoritarianism party state. And then both the people and the communist leaders knew that whatever bond they might once have shared had long since been lost. Re-establishing that bond so that the state could implement the politics of austerity was the reason communist governments democratized themselves in the late 1980s. And this pattern repeated across the Soviet bloc, spurring the revolutions of 1989. Now, in Moscow, the Kremlin designed after the oil crisis to lessen the material burden of its empire, as we mentioned, and to lessen the burden of the arms race under Gorbachev, which spurred his foreign policy options. So he had a nuclear arms diplomacy. He repealed more aggressive policies of his predecessors. He accepted a highly asymmetric intermediate range nuclear forces treaty in 1987. He announced a unilateral withdrawal of Soviet forces from Eastern Europe at the United Nations in 1988, and he accepted non-communist governments in Eastern Europe in 1989 and agreed to German unification on Western terms in 1990. And these are all attempts to cut back Soviet military spending and the subsidized energy deliveries to give the Soviet people more butter, as we call it, so more money for domestic consumption. Gorbachev thought that if he could free the central, and now I'm using the Soviet Union in terms of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarusia, if he could free the central Soviet Union from the burden of weapons and the Eastern European allies, perhaps he might not be able have to break promises to his people. But the Soviet Union would falter on for only a couple more years because of the collapse of world energy prices and Gorbachev's failure to impose economic discipline. By early 1990, the Western banks would only lend to Moscow with the support of their Western governments. This meant that the Kremlin's access to hard currency depended on the political opinion prevailing in Western capitals, which quickly declined as Gorbachev's failures increased. The final months of the dissolution of the Soviet Union is a really fascinating, more political story, which we can't go into here. But we've gone into the antecedent causes in terms of political economy terms. And then on the 8th of December, 1991, the leaders of the Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian socialist states within the Soviet Union secretly met and signed the Bel-Azhar Accords, which proclaimed the Soviet Union had ceased to exist. Now, these accords were then subsequently passed by the respective parliamentary legislatures, and the Soviet Union ended. Now, importantly, the same forces that weakened the communist bloc standing on global capital markets renewed the United States' preeminent position in the international system. Paul Volcker's choice to impose his shock on the American population was the key act of renewal for the structural power of the United States in the international system in the post-war period. Volcker's willingness to impose unprecedented economic discipline on the American people showed global capital holders that American policymakers could and would ultimately protect the interests of capital over the interests of labor. In return, they rewarded American policymakers and citizens with a deluge of capital inflows that erased the United States' choice between, guns and butter, or feeding their own people on the other hand. It renewed American prosperity. It worsened inequality and underwrote the projection of American power abroad. These two facts have allowed the United States to remain hegemonic in the international system since 1980. The US dollar's undiminished role as the world's reserve currency, and the United States' ability to run virtually continuous budget and global account deficits for 40 years. And these are both results of the confidence that Volcker gave global capital holders that their money was safe in American hands. Now, in the next video, after all of that, we will briefly address, maybe hopefully a bit more briefly, the collapse of the Social Republic of Yugoslavia before more substantially addressing the crises of the 1990s in Eastern Europe and Bosnia, which is vital for understanding the international political economy currents that then occur later. So thank you for joining me for this first lecture, team. I'll see you in lecture 2.